Welcome to the Beginner's Guide to all things economic, political, and sociocultural. Here we will be sharing quick bites into all the topics, concepts, and theories that we all talk about but should probably know a little bit more about. I'll be doing my best to keep it all unbiased, to the point, and hopefully interesting enough to inspire you to dig a little deeper on your own. With that being said, I'm your host, Emmy Davis, and this is the Beginner's Guide to Socialist Economic Theory. Nearly all of us have heard that life isn't fair. If you haven't, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but it's true. Life isn't fair. But should it be? Knowing that life is not fair, should we be doing all that we can as a society to make it fair? This is the philosophical root of many political questions. Questions that still lack consensus and divide us to this day. What is the fundamental role of government? What constitutes a human right, and what happens if not everyone agrees? How big of a role should justice and equality play in a society? Also, what do those words even mean? Depending on who you ask, you could have a number of meanings attributed to them. For the sake of this discussion, I'm going to share what I feel are most applicable. When we're thinking about justice, one or both of these definitions should arise. First, political justice. This simply means giving equal political rights and opportunities to all citizens so that they may be able to take part in the administration of the country. Second, philosophical justice. As far as we know, Aristotle was the first to claim that justice is the concept of a proper proportion between what someone deserves, bad or good, and what they end up experiencing, both bad and good. Equality, despite what many say today, does not mean equity. Essentially, equality aims to ensure that each individual is given the same chance at reaching a goal. Equity aims to ensure that each individual receives exactly what they need in order to reach the goal. The simplest way to think about it is equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. Capitalism and the free market aim to ensure equality between citizens, whereas socialism aims to ensure that citizens can achieve equity on a large scale. Socialism is a populist economic and political system based on public ownership of the means of production. Those means include the machinery, tools, and factories used to produce the goods that aim to directly satisfy human needs. There are many variations of socialism, each one with its own version of political economics and political philosophy. However, the majority of all socialist theories do share the following beliefs. 1. The public or collective ownership of the means of production. 2. Central planning by the government. 3. An emphasis on equality and economic security. 4. The goal of reducing class distinctions. 5. The ideal that production is for use and not profit. 6. Wealth and material resources should be distributed among people in an equitable way. Remember the difference between equity and equality. 7. There should be no more competitive buying and selling in the market. And 8. People should have free access to goods and services. Under a true socialist system, it's the government's role to determine output and pricing levels. The challenge is synchronizing these decisions with the needs of consumers, since there are no other market forces to take note of. Under certain socialist nations, property, with the exception of some personal property like clothing, is owned by the public. In other socialist societies, individuals can still own some private property, such as houses. As I mentioned a moment ago, there are quite a few variations of socialist economic theory. Since the first murmurs of its philosophy, people have tried to apply it to a number of economies and societies around the world. The names of Vladimir Lenin, Karl Marx, Mao Zedong, Hugo Chavez, today's Bernie Sanders, and AOC should all sound at least a little familiar and should ping something in your mind about socialism. Side note, socialism and communism are often wrongly used interchangeably. I added, deleted, and re-added the mention of Mao Zedong for this reason. It gets a little confusing because, as I said, there are a number of socialistic economic theories out there. Plus, communism is often the term given to reference a particular form of socialism known as Marxist Leninism, which spawned the revolutions of the Soviet Union and China during the 20th century. Technically, communism is a philosophical peak and practical end goal of socialism. This was at least the thought purported in the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and his lesser-known co-author, Friedrich Engels. Socialism predates communism by a number of decades. Socialism developed as a form of opposition to the excess liberal individualism and the capitalistic economic structures that began to thrive in the late 18th and 19th centuries of Western Europe. The early supporters called for a more egalitarian distribution of wealth, better working conditions, joint ownership among workers of the land and equipment used in the manufacturing, as well as overall solidarity among workers. They also believed that socialistic reform did not need to rise out of a class revolution, but could effectively reform existing social and political structures, no matter the type of political system. With the publication of the Communist Manifesto, the socialist, social, political, and economic theories were brought together under one new umbrella: Marxism. Marxism focused on the class differences and that true justice and equality would only arise from the revolt of income workers, the proletariat, against the wealthy bourgeoisie. For him, the socialist revolution would topple capitalism and allow a path for communism to ultimately be enacted. And under the communist regime, everyone would be equal and no longer suffer from the injustices of the class system, and thus a utopia could finally flourish. With the exception of a few modern examples, the application of socialist theories have resulted in tragedy.
This is what socialism does, and now the people are taking to the streets in massive numbers.
And the people of Venezuela are saying that 17 years of socialism.
The government having sole control over the economy and its country's markets required an enormous concentration of power.
Protests have broken out in Cuba, with thousands of people taking to the streets against the communist government. Demonstrators expressed frustration at food shortages, rising prices, and the lack of COVID vaccines.
For true believers, this meant that they had to be willing to see their current state wither away before they can build a new, better state.
Now, critics say it is a country ruled by a communist regime which stifles any kind of political opposition. On the other hand, though, Vietnam has chosen to embrace market economy and has seen an impressive growth rate. That's
okay. 17 years ago, socialists or social democrats were governing in almost all the big EU countries like France, Germany, and the UK. Now, they've been pushed to the borders of the European Union. In France, the socialists scored a humiliating 6.3% in this year's presidential election.
In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin's collectivization efforts took an estimated 6 to 10 million of his own citizens' lives, while China's Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward led to a man-made famine that killed 45 million Chinese. Millions more died from a range of socialistic policies under regimes in North Korea to Ethiopia to Venezuela. In every one of these cases, the rulers were well aware that their policies were causing death on a mass scale, but felt that the promise of a utopia was worth the loss of life. Supporters of socialism often blame these tragedies on the flaws of the particular regime, rather than suggesting that there could be an inherent flaw in the socialist policy they were enforcing. Taking the discussion away from any specific case studies, economists point out that even if the government can adjust prices, that the lack of competition within the market severely disincentivizes the participants. Furthermore, they point out that it would result in an inefficient bureaucracy that would, in theory, be responsible for pricing and adjusting thousands of products. The sheer volume and complexity of the volatile marketplace would render them ineffective in responding to any market fluctuation. It's worth noting that a society without competition, money, and private property has never materialized, and the history of the 20th century suggests that it's likely an unworkable concept. Many supporters praise socialism for its focus on raising the standard of living, a sentiment that is no doubt a noble one. Some countries have adopted a hybrid economic system called social democracy. Social democracy is based on a capitalist market system paired with a government-run social program. Instead of the government coming into each home and business, mandating specific participation for specific wages, these countries largely leave the capitalist market to do what it does best. The government-run social programs are funded through the high tax rates which everyone is required to pay. Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden are all currently considered socially democratic. Here in the United States, we have adopted a number of socialistic policies. In fact, some of the socialistic ideals have become so ingrained that they have become part of how we see ourselves as Americans. Most of these policies are in the name of helping people. Unemployment, Social Security, health insurance, public education. Today, the debate centers around those philosophical questions of what is equal and just and how much should the government be responsible for. Seeing inequality and wanting to adjust society and the economy accordingly is a worthy thing to strive for. Ironically, thus far, the very policies that have been proposed to accomplish this goal have consistently resulted in the opposite. The idea of a social safety net may spur from the socialist economic theory, but when looking at the successful case studies, we find that it is actually the capitalistic free market policies that allow those society safety nets to exist. I'm going to end this one with a purely subjective thought. I think that it's important to remember that there is a rather large difference between the theory behind socialistic policy and what happens when they're actually implemented. The quest for economic and political equality and justice should always play a role in policy debates. However, we must not fool ourselves into thinking that we will somehow not fall into what history has shown us to happen every time. Ideals are not always practical, and what is practical is not always ideal. When it comes to anything political, it's crucial to remember that there is always so many factors at play, both good and bad. This has been the Beginner's Guide to Socialistic Economic Theory, and I'm your host, Emmy Davis. This podcast is a subject entertainment production for Free Markets Destroy, a project of the Washington Policy Center. Free Markets Destroy celebrates the power of free markets to tackle humanity's most daunting challenges. The world isn't perfect, but it's getting better every day thanks to entrepreneurs who work tirelessly to deliver life-changing innovations. Washington Policy Center is a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy research organization that publishes studies, sponsors events, and educates citizens on vital public policy issues. For more information on either, check out freemarketsdestroy.com or washingtonpolicy.org. As always, thanks for listening, and do your own research.